What if the quietest moment of your life became the key that unlocked the destiny you thought you'd lost forever? In a snowy mountain town, a young waitress named Claire Whitford spoke a single sentence in a language no one expected her to know. That one compassionate act in a fading diner did more than help a lost traveler. It caught the eye of a stranger who didn't just see a waitress wiping tables. He saw a buried brilliance waiting to rise again. This is the story of a mysterious black envelope delivered in a blizzard, a private jet bound for Seattle, and a challenge so daring it could break her completely, or transform her into the woman she was created to be. The winter sun hung low over Riverbend, Colorado, casting a pale gold across the snow-packed streets and rooftops that clung to the mountainside like stubborn barnacles. The town was small, quiet, and aged in that nostalgic way where time didn't stop but simply slowed its pace out of courtesy. Cold winds flowed down from the high ridges, brushing against pine trees and sending white powder swirling across the asphalt. The air carried a bite sharp enough to make breath visible, and every sound felt muffled, almost softened, as though the snow itself was determined to hush the world. In the heart of this sleepy place stood the Blue Elk Diner, a squat, weather-beaten building of faded teal walls and neon signage that flickered with a persistent buzz. Inside, the warmth was artificial and stale, but it wrapped itself around people who came seeking cheap coffee, hot pie, and the illusion that life hadn't passed them by. Behind the counter moved Claire Whitford, a 27-year-old American waitress with fair-skinned chestnut-brown hair and eyes the color of burnt caramel, soft, observant, and quietly exhausted. Claire stood at 5'6" with a slender, almost delicate frame that carried itself with a subtle grace, though it was often overshadowed by fatigue. Her hair, usually tied in a loose ponytail, had become frizzy at the ends due to endless shifts and the diner's greasy air. Life hadn't been cruel to her, but it had been unrelenting in its indifference. She was the kind of woman who blended into the background, not because she lacked beauty or presence, but because she'd spent years teaching herself how to stay small. Beneath her calm, collected exterior lay an unspoken ache, an unfinished story of a girl who once dreamed of becoming a linguist and traveling the world. Years ago, she had studied abroad in Montreal, mastering French with a near-native fluency that impressed professors and annoyed classmates. But after her mother's sudden illness and the financial burden that followed, Claire abandoned her academic life and returned to Riverbend. That decision, necessary but devastating, left a permanent shadow over her confidence. She buried her dreams the way townspeople buried secrets in winter under too much snow to dig back up. Now she worked at the Blue Elk Diner 6 days a week, moving with the efficiency of muscle memory. Her smile was polite, never forced, but never quite reaching her eyes. Customers often described her as sweet, quiet, or reliable. No one ever guessed she spoke multiple languages or once dissected poetry in French cafes. At the grill station was Howard Briggs, the diner's head cook, a burly man in his mid-50s with a round belly, thick gray beard, and permanently stained apron. Howard had a gentle demeanor despite his rough appearance, and though he rarely spoke of his past, the weary slouch in his shoulders hinted at a life marked by regrets. Rumor had it that he once dreamed of owning his own steakhouse, but financial ruin and a divorce had stripped that away. He'd since settled into a quiet acceptance, moving through life at the slow pace of a man who'd stopped expecting surprises. At the hostess stand was Emily Raines, a 19-year-old college dropout with bright blonde hair freckles sprinkled across her cheeks and wide, anxious blue eyes. Emily was sweet-natured but clumsy, a bit scatterbrained, from juggling 2 part-time jobs and caring for her sick grandfather. She admired Claire deeply and often clung to her like a younger sister, seeking guidance and reassurance whenever a customer raised their voice. The Blue Elk's morning rush had faded to a lull. Snow began tapping against the windows, drifting slowly but persistently. Claire wiped down table after table, humming under her breath to fill the silence. There was comfort in repetition, even if it slowly hollowed her out. The only customer who broke the monotony was Peter Lorne, a wealthy tourist who had spent the better part of the morning criticizing his food, the service, the temperature, and even the texture of the air. Peter was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, with meticulously styled blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the unearned arrogance of someone who thought they looked like an intellectual. He wore a navy cashmere coat, expensive leather gloves, and a silver watch he made sure everyone saw. His personality was grating, demanding, impatient, and convinced the world existed to inconvenience him. Claire handled him with measured politeness, though internally she counted the seconds until he left. But in the far corner booth sat someone entirely different, a stranger who didn't belong to the usual cast of locals or passing tourists. He wore a dark green flannel jacket, black jeans, and scuffed leather boots. Early 30s perhaps, with short dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and sharp observant eyes that flicked quietly between the room and the snowfall outside. His name remained unknown, but his presence felt oddly significant. He held a simple cup of black coffee, untouched more often than sipped, as though he was more interested in watching than drinking. His posture was relaxed yet attentive. He wasn't checking a phone. He wasn't rushing. He was studying. Claire noticed him, but assumed he was just another introverted traveler, the kind who preferred to observe life rather than speak to it. She didn't know he had watched her for nearly an hour, watched the way she apologized to rude customers, comforted nervous ones, and moved with quiet precision even when exhaustion tugged at her limbs. The door chimed, letting in a gust of icy wind, followed by an elderly woman in her late 70s. She was petite, wrapped in a long beige coat, with a pale blue scarf tied around her neck. Her silver hair was carefully pinned, but her hands trembled slightly as she clutched an oversized tote bag. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, and her eyes darted nervously around the diner. Her name wasn't known yet, but her confusion was visible. She stepped toward the hostess stand where Emily stood. "Hello," the elderly woman stammered in broken English. "Please?" "Table." Emily blinked. "A table. For A1." The woman attempted again, flustered. This time she spoke in French quickly, nervously explaining that she was lost, her phone battery had died, and she had taken the wrong bus. Her voice trembled with embarrassment. Emily stepped back, overwhelmed. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Peter Lorne groaned loudly from his table. "Oh, for heaven's sake, let someone cultured handle this." He stood up, puffing his chest. "Bonjour, madame," he said in a butchered accent. Table we sit, down." He waved erratically at an empty booth. The woman looked even more distressed. Claire paused mid-step, her heart tugging in discomfort. She had long accepted that her fluency in French was a ghost from another life, one she rarely summoned here. But seeing the elderly woman's panic and hearing Peter's painful attempt to help made something in her chest snap loose. She approached gently. "Excuse me," she said softly to the woman. Then, in fluent warm French that flowed like a melody, she'd forgotten she knew, she said, "Madame, tout va bien. Vous êtes en sécurité ici. Je peux vous aider." "Ma'am, it's all right. You're safe here. I can help you." The diner fell silent. Emily's jaw dropped. Peter froze. Even Howard peeked from the kitchen, the elderly woman's expression transformed relief, flooding her face. "Merci, merci. Je suis perdue. Je ne connais pas cette ville." Claire guided her kindly, asking questions, offering calm reassurance, and helping her find a place to sit. She explained everything with gentle clarity, her voice lilting with the accent she had once been praised for. She wrote directions on a napkin, offered water, and made sure she was comfortable. The corner booth stranger watched all of it, his gaze sharpening with interest, not invasive, but analytical, as though he had just witnessed the opening of a locked door. Claire didn't notice. She was too busy helping the woman, too unaware of how effortlessly she had revealed a piece of herself she thought long buried. She had no idea that a simple moment of kindness, spoken in a forgotten language, had already begun to change her fate. The storm rolled into Riverbend long before the sun disappeared, swallowing the town in a thick white haze that blurred the mountains and muted the streetlights until they glowed like distant lanterns floating through fog. Snowflakes whipped across the narrow roads with the frantic, swirling energy of a winter determined to bury everything beneath it. By the time Claire Whitford stepped out of the Blue Elk Diner after closing, the world had turned into a cold white maze. The wind clawed at her cheeks, reddening her fair skin and stinging her eyes as she squinted into the storm. Her breath formed soft clouds that scattered instantly. She tightened her coat, pulling the hood over her chestnut brown hair. The night felt heavier than usual, like the storm carried something unseen, waiting for her just beyond the halo of the diner's flickering lights. She'd stayed late helping Emily fix a jammed receipt printer and wiping down tables for the morning shift. The elderly French woman had left safely after Claire wrote out directions and made sure she got into a cab. Everything had returned to normal, or so Claire thought. She hadn't noticed the stranger in the green flannel jacket slip out of the diner minutes after the woman left. She never saw him pause at the corner, watching her through the snowfall, with eyes that held the glint of a decision already made. Claire was halfway down the employee side path when she heard hurried boots crunching through the snow behind her. "Claire, hey, wait up." She turned to see Howard Briggs, the cook, lumbering through the drifts. His heavy coat tan, frayed at the sleeves, strained around his thick shoulders. Snow clung to his beard like powdered sugar on a donut. His face was flushed partly from exertion and partly from the cold air assaulting his lungs. Howard rarely moved this fast, unless something urgent was involved, and even then he disliked the concept of urgent. "You forgot to sign out," Claire called over the wind. "No," he huffed, stopping in front of her and catching his breath. "Someone came back. After you went to the restroom to grab your bag." He lifted his hand. In it was a sleek black envelope, thick cardstock with a smooth matte texture. It looked wildly out of place against Howard's grease-smudged fingers. He said, "This was for you. Told me to put it directly in your hands. Not Emily's. Not the register. You." Claire stared at it, an uneasy flutter blooming in her stomach. "Who tall guy?" Howard said. "The one in the corner. Quiet, dark hair. Didn't order much except coffee." Claire's heart flickered oddly. The man who watched everything yet said nothing. Did he say why? Nope, Howard replied, pushing the envelope toward her. But he looked serious. The kind of serious rich people get when they're about to sue you. Claire laughed under her breath, despite the cold. Great. Maybe he didn't like the coffee. Or, Howard countered, his tone softening, maybe he liked something else. Claire rolled her eyes, but her cheeks warmed not from the weather. She hesitated, then finally accepted the envelope. It felt heavier than she expected. Weighty. Important. Howard shoved his hands into his pockets. "Be careful out there, kiddo. Storm's only getting worse." Then he trudged back toward the diner boots, sinking deep with each step. Claire stood alone under the dim back-alley security light, snow spiraling around her like frantic confetti. With cold fingers, she broke the elegant silver seal pressed onto the flap, an emblem shaped like a stylized pair of wings. Inside were two items. The first was a black business card thick enough to feel like cut stone. Silver embossed lettering glowed faintly under the light. Evan Calder, CEO, Calder Aeronautics. Claire's breath hitched. Calder Aeronautics wasn't just a company, it was a giant. A leader in aviation engineering known for cutting-edge private aircraft design and aerospace technology. Evan Calder was a name whispered with admiration, envy, or fear, depending on which industry you asked. Rumored to be brilliant, elusive, difficult to contact, and even harder to impress. The stranger in the diner was him. Before she could process that, she unfolded the second item, a jet reservation slip printed on premium paper. Seattle. Departure tomorrow, noon. Passenger, Claire Whitford. She almost dropped everything into the snow and then tucked inside a handwritten note in sharp, decisive pen strokes. A voice like yours shouldn't be buried beneath routine. If you're willing to step forward, a door awaits. A car will arrive at 8:00 a.m. This is not an obligation. It is an invitation to reclaim something you lost. E.C. The wind howled around her, but Claire felt utterly still, as if time had frozen even more completely than the streets beneath her feet. She read it again and again. The cold bit into her legs, but she didn't move. It was absurd, impossible, terrifying, and yet thrilling. It wasn't romance. She wasn't naive enough to think a billionaire became interested in her personally based on one conversation in French. But the precision and confidence of the note, the certainty shook her. Why her why language? Why today Claire didn't realize her hands were numb until a voice cut through the storm. Claire. You okay? She turned to see Mrs. Lila Donahue, her neighbor from 2 buildings down. A short, round woman in her late 60s, with fluffy white hair sticking out from under her knitted hat. Lila was bundled in layers of mismatched scarves and a purple coat. She always carried a tote bag filled with seed packets for her backyard birds, an odd hobby for a woman allergic to feathers. Lila squinted through the snow. You're standing there like the cold turned you into a statue. Claire forced a smile, just distracted. Lila peered at the envelope. Love letter? Not exactly. Lila chuckled, cheeks rosy. Well, sweetheart, whatever it is, you shouldn't read it out in weather that could kill a polar bear. Claire nodded and headed toward her apartment building. Lila followed her partway before turning down her driveway, waving with mittened hands. As Claire climbed the stairs to her apartment, her thoughts churned wildly. The black envelope felt like a living thing in her coat pocket, warm and electric against her palm. When she pushed open her front door, heat rushed to greet her. The apartment was small but cozy. One couch, a threadbare rug, shelves crammed with second-hand books, and a small dining table cluttered with unpaid bills. Jenna Collins, Claire's roommate, looked up from the couch. She was 25, sharp-eyed with auburn hair, in a messy bun, wearing plaid pajamas, and wrapped in a blanket like a disgruntled burrito. Jenna worked as a paralegal and had trust issues sharp enough to cut steel, mostly because she'd grown up watching her mother get conned repeatedly by charming men who promised everything and delivered nothing. She lifted a brow. You look like you found a murder confession in the alley. Claire wordlessly handed her the envelope. Jenna read the note once and shot up from the couch. No. Nope. Absolutely not. This is how people get kidnapped, Claire. This is how documentaries start. Claire laughed weakly, kicking off her boots. It's not like that. Private jet billionaire secret invitation. That's exactly like that. But why would he? Because he's a weirdo with money. Jenna paced the living room like a stressed attorney. No normal person sends strangers first-class abduction invitations in fancy paper. Despite the spiraling panic, Jenna's protectiveness warmed Claire's heart. She sat on the couch, rubbing her temples. He saw me help that French woman. Maybe he's offering a job, or something. Jenna stopped pacing and stared. Claire? He watched you for what, an hour? Rich men who watch women silently for an hour do not invite them to opportunities. They invite them to horror tropes. Claire swallowed but didn't look away. But what if? It's real, Jenna's expression softened. She sank onto the couch beside her, pulling the blanket around both their shoulders. Do you want it to be? Claire's eyes drifted toward the envelope lying between them. It glowed under the lamp like a black star. Fear pulsed in her chest, but so did longing. I don't know, she whispered. Maybe I do? The storm outside roared on, rattling the windows. Somewhere in Seattle, a boardroom waited, a negotiation crumbled, and a billionaire made a quiet, calculated decision that a waitress in a small mountain town might be the key he needed. And in Riverbend, Claire Whitford sat holding a choice that could alter her entire future. A door had opened. All she had to do was step through it. The morning arrived with an eerie stillness, as if Riverbend itself were holding its breath. The storm had passed, leaving the streets buried under sculpted drifts of white. The mountains that framed the town stood sharp and silent against a sky so pale it looked washed clean. At 8:00 a.m., a black SUV with tinted windows rolled up to Claire Whitford's apartment building, its engine humming low and steady, like a creature patiently waiting. Claire stood at the doorway with her modest suitcase heart pounding beneath her wool coat. Her chestnut brown hair was brushed smooth for once, falling gently around her face, though nervousness kept her tucking it behind her ear every other second. The car's presence felt surreal in this small mountain town, like a shard of another world had pierced through the snow. Behind her, Jenna Collins, fiery-haired and pajama-clad, despite the cold, crossed her arms and frowned with the ferocity of a worried mother bear. Jenna had barely slept. Dark circles smudged beneath her sharp green eyes, and her normally sarcastic mouth tightened into a hard line. She was petite, but fierce, the kind of woman whose protective instincts had been shaped by a lifetime of watching her mother repeat dangerous patterns with the wrong men. Jenna didn't trust power, wealth, or charm, especially not when wrapped in the form of a mysterious billionaire. "You're sure about this?" Jenna asked, her voice tense. "One last chance to back out before the abduction van drives away with you." Claire tried to smile. "It's not an abduction van. It might as well be. It's black, it's shiny, and it showed up at exactly 8, like it was choreographed by a cult." Before Claire could respond, the driver stepped out. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with neatly cropped salt and pepper hair, a clean-shaven jaw, and a posture so squared and upright it screamed military background. His uniform was a crisp black chauffeur suit, complemented by leather gloves. His eyes were a clear ice-gray calm, but intensely observant, the kind of gaze that noted everything and judged nothing. "Miss Whitford." His voice was smooth, neutral, professional. "I'm Daniel Graves. Mr. Calder sent me to escort you to the airport." Claire nodded softly. Daniel stepped forward and lifted her modest suitcase with ease. He moved efficiently, saying little, but something in his demeanor felt reassuring rather than intimidating. There was no threat in the way he carried himself, only discipline and quiet respect. Claire sensed he was a man who had lived 2 or 3 entire lives before becoming a driver. Jenna tugged Claire aside for a final whispered warning. "If he tries anything, scream the airport down, and text me every hour on the hour." "I will," Claire promised, squeezing Jenna's hand. With a last fortifying breath of icy mountain air, Claire climbed into the SUV. As the door shut, Jenna's worried figure grew smaller in the rear window until she disappeared behind the glittering snowbanks. The drive to Denver's private aviation terminal took nearly 3 hours. Through the tinted glass, Claire watched the pine forests thin, out the mountains flatten, and the sharp horizons of the Colorado plains unfurl. Daniel drove with methodical precision, barely glancing at her, the radio off the world outside, muffled except for the distant hum of tires cutting through slush. Her mind tumbled between fear and possibility. Why her why language? Why the certainty of Evan Calder's invitation? She clutched the black business card in her coat pocket like a talisman from a universe she had accidentally brushed against. When the SUV finally pulled into the private hangar, Claire almost forgot to breathe. A sleek silver jet, far smaller than a commercial plane, but impossibly elegant, waited under a canopy of steel beams. It gleamed like a blade. Daniel opened her door and offered a polite nod. "Safe travels, Miss Whitford." Inside the jet, the flight attendant introduced herself as Lana Pierce, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair in a smooth bun, clear blue eyes, and a posture perfected by years of balancing trays in turbulence. Lana had a warm, approachable smile, the kind that softened even the coldest of luxuries. Her voice held the faintest hint of a southern drawl, suggesting she grew up somewhere slower than this high-polished world. "If you need anything, please let me know," Lana said, her kindness neither forced nor scripted. The jet's interior was a cocoon of soft leather seats, dim gold lighting, and polished wood trim. Claire sank into a seat by the window, heart still racing. As the engines roared to life, she glanced down at Riverbend, shrinking beneath the clouds, its snow-covered rooftops fading into white blur. 7 hours later, Seattle greeted her with gray skies and gentle rain tapping against the runway. The city was a cathedral of steel and fog, its skyline cloaked in clouds that looked heavy with untold stories. The jet rolled to a stop beside a private terminal. Lana bid her farewell, and Claire stepped into a new chapter of her life. Waiting for her inside the terminal was another chauffeur, a lean, silent man in his early 30s named Marcus Hale. He had short, sandy brown hair, a faint scar above his right eyebrow, and a stoic expression suggesting he'd seen his share of conflict. His olive skin and athletic build hinted at a past in law enforcement or private security. He offered a polite bow of his head, but spoke little. Marcus drove her through the city toward a towering glass building overlooking the harbor. Calder Aeronautics headquarters dominated the skyline, sleek, modern, efficient. It looked like a place where decisions reshaped industries. Claire felt small just looking at it. Inside, she was escorted to a high-floor conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the gray shimmer of Puget Sound. Waiting there was Evan Calder. He stood near the glass hands in his pockets, gazing at the harbor below. In daylight, he looked even more striking, tall, with dark hair cut neatly, faint stubble along a sharp jawline, and eyes a cool steel blue that reflected an analytical mind constantly running calculations. He was in his late 30s, athletic, without bulk, wearing a charcoal suit that fit with understated elegance. But it was his presence, not his wealth or posture, that made the air seem to still around him. He turned when she entered. "Miss Whitford," he greeted, his voice smooth and low. "Thank you for coming." Claire swallowed, nerves fluttering like birds in her chest. "I thought about not coming." His lips twitched faintly. "I suspected you might. But you did? That speaks volumes." He gestured for her to sit. As she did, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes leveled at hers with unnerving sincerity. "You're wondering why you're here?" he said. "Yes," she replied. "Very much." Because he said simply, "You have something my team lacks, something I cannot manufacture or buy." Her brows knitted. "Which is cultural fluency, empathy, nuance." His tone remained steady. Factual, not flattering. "Yesterday in Riverbend, you bridged a gap that couldn't be crossed by language alone. The way you approached that woman, your tone, your posture, the way you read her emotion before her words, that is a skill I cannot replicate with any expert on my payroll." Claire felt heat rise to her face. She opened her mouth, but he continued. "I'm currently negotiating a delicate acquisition with the Harrington family," he said. "They run a heritage aerospace interiors company. Their matriarch, Margaret Harrington, refuses to yield. She's a small woman with silver hair, 80 years old, sharp as a blade. She believes we want to modernize away her legacy." He paused briefly. Her grandson, Wyatt Harrington, however, sees the decline coming. He's in his early 30s. Tall, sandy blonde hair disheveled in a charmingly distracted way. A designer with passion but no authority. He wants innovation. She wants preservation. They are stalemated. Claire nodded, absorbing every detail. "And you think I can—" Do something about that. I think Evan said, "You can open doors, we can't." Just as you did in the diner. Silence settled between them for a moment. Claire felt the weight of the opportunity and the fear tightly coiled beneath it. Finally she whispered, "Why me?" He answered without hesitation. "Because you listen. Most people don't." The words hit her deep, awakening something long dormant. Outside, Seattle's rain streaked the window like silver threads, weaving a bridge between what she was and what she could become. A door had opened, and maybe for the first time in years, Claire wasn't afraid to step through it. The next morning unfolded beneath a Seattle sky smothered in low, rolling clouds, the kind that made the entire city glimmer faintly with silver light. Rain misted over the harbor, drawing thin, wavering reflections across the gray water. The air smelled of wet pavement and salt, and the wind brushed through the streets with the soft chill of a whispered warning. Claire Whitford stood inside the marble-floored lobby of Calder Aeronautics headquarters, palms slightly damp heart, thudding in a nervous rhythm beneath her blouse. She had dressed carefully, a simple cream sweater under a tailored navy coat, her chestnut brown hair tied back loosely in a way that framed her fair features without looking overly deliberate. She wanted to appear calm, capable, and unobtrusively professional, three traits she hoped would carry her through whatever impossible task awaited. A security guard named Adrian Lowe guided her to the elevators. Adrian was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with cocoa-brown skin, a shaved head, and a calm baritone voice. His uniform fit him with crisp precision, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had once served in the Coast Guard. Years rescuing people in harsh ocean storms had carved a deep patience into him. He didn't pry or ask questions. He simply saw anxious people every day and understood how to move them gently forward. "They're expecting you on the 50th floor," he said kindly. "You'll do fine." The elevator opened into a hallway lined with minimalist artwork, sweeping lines, carved metals, and abstract landscapes. Claire followed the corridor until she reached a glass conference room where Evan Calder stood reviewing a set of documents with two assistants. Evan looked sharper than the day before, a charcoal suit white shirt, open at the collar, faint stubble, outlining his jaw. His steel blue eyes flickered with concentration, yet when he noticed Claire, something in his expression softened, an acknowledgement that she was here ready. He approached her with measured steps. "Morning," he said. "Are you nervous?" terrified Claire admitted. "Good," he replied with a faint smile. "Nervous means you're aware of the stakes, but remember you're not here to perform. You're here to listen." Before she could respond, a new voice entered the room. "Mr. Calder, the Harrington family has arrived?" They were led down another hallway to a private executive salon designed for high-profile negotiations. Inside, the tension hit Claire before she even crossed the threshold. Sitting on the far side of the room was Margaret Harrington. She was smaller than Claire expected, barely 5 feet tall, but carried herself with the poised authority of a queen, whose crown was invisible but unmistakable. Her silver hair was styled in a perfectly layered bob, smooth and immaculate. Deep-set eyes, the color of stormy steel, studied the room, as if every detail were a test waiting to be graded. Her navy suit was tailored with old-world precision, and a simple string of pearls rested on her collarbone. At 80 years old, she radiated a presence sharpened by decades of defending her family's legacy. Her expression was polite, but cooled by distrust. Next to her stood her grandson, Wyatt Harrington, tall and lanky in his early 30s, with sandy blonde hair that curled messily at the ends, despite his attempts to tame it. His hazel eyes gave him a boyish earnestness, though his posture carried the burden of someone trying to keep an entire legacy from collapsing. He wore a pale gray suit that was slightly wrinkled, a testament to sleepless nights spent sketching in his design studio. Wyatt had a creative mind, but a restless energy, always tapping his foot, always half lost in thought. He respected his grandmother deeply, but quietly disagreed with her fear of modernization. He hoped today would shift something. Behind them was Charles Everett, the family's legal advisor, an older man in his mid-60s with wiry white eyebrows, small round glasses, and a stiff posture that suggested he was held together by nothing but duty. He had served the Harringtons for 40 years and guarded their interests with the rigidity of a gatekeeper who had seen too many businessmen betray promises. As Claire entered, Margaret gave her a cursory glance, sharp assessing, uninterested. Wyatt, however, offered a small, unsure smile. Charles merely nodded coldly. The meeting began with tension so dense it felt like a weight pressing into the room. Evans' senior negotiator launched into a polished presentation full of charts, financial projections, and digital platforms. His name was Alan Murdoch, a tall, angular man in his late 40s with neatly combed dark hair and a demeanor that exuded confidence, bordering on arrogance. His gray suit was impeccable, his gold tie clipped straight, and his manner of speech overly assertive. Alan was brilliant at numbers, terrible at nuance. As he spoke about streamlining heritage assets into scalable modernization initiatives, Margaret's lips thinned into a disapproving line. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably, shooting her anxious glances. Claire sat quietly at the edge of the room, absorbing everything, the clipped tones, the stiff posture, the subtle shifts of emotion. After 15 minutes, Margaret raised a trembling hand, not from frailty, but from sharpened precision. Enough, she said in a French-accented English that carried both grace and warning. I have heard these words before, vague promises dressed in modern terminology. But you speak of my life's work as though it were merely a product line. Alan attempted to continue, but she cut him off with the cold efficiency of someone who had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. My husband built our company with his hands, she said, with tools and sweat, not software. Silence rippled across the table. Evan watched, jaw tightening slightly. Claire could see his frustration not at Margaret, but at his own team's inability to understand her language, the one spoken between heart and heritage. Alan tried again. Madame Harrington, with all due respect, the brand needs— It needs respect, she snapped, which you have not shown. Claire felt the moment cracking. No one here was speaking to Margaret's soul, only her logic, and logic wasn't the battleground she was fighting on. Her eyes drifted around the room until something caught her attention. On the wall behind Margaret hung a framed aviator's blueprint, old parchment corners faded. It showed a cross-section of a handcrafted aircraft interior model from the 1950s. The lines were meticulous. The label at the bottom read, Harrington Series Y Design by Eleanor Harrington. Claire inhaled softly. She stood. Everyone turned. Forgive me, she said gently. May I ask about this piece? Margaret blinked, startled. This, she asked. It is. Nothing relevant to business. Claire stepped closer, studying it carefully. It's beautiful. The draftsmanship, the precision, and the signature Eleanor Harrington. Your mother? The old woman's posture stiffened, then softened almost imperceptibly. Yes, she designed our first luxury aircraft cabin. She was an artist before she was a craftswoman. Claire nodded, then shifted into French soft, respectful lyrical. Elle avait une vision rare, she said. She had a rare vision. Margaret froze. The air changed. Claire continued, her voice warm. I see it in the way she drew the curves of the cabin. She wasn't designing a product. She was designing an experience of feeling. She built something meant to last beyond trends. Something with a soul. Wyatt stared at Claire, astonished. Even Evan leaned forward, eyes narrowing with dawning understanding. Claire turned back to Margaret. Madame, you fear the company will lose its soul. But perhaps the right hand's hands that respect Eleanor's legacy can help it reach a new era without erasing its past. Her words hung in the room like a bridge, forming plank by plank. Margaret studied her eyes, shining faintly. You speak as if you knew her, the old woman whispered. "No," Claire said softly, "but I understand what she cared about." Because I listened, Wyatt's voice broke the silence. "Grandmother, maybe this doesn't have to be a loss. Maybe it can be a continuation." Slowly, Margaret nodded. For the first time, the iron wall cracked. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we may continue the discussion next week." A private conversation. Her eyes landed on Claire. "And you, Miss Whitford, will attend." The meeting ended soon after. It wasn't a victory, but it was a beginning. Evan caught Claire's gaze as they walked out, something new flickering behind his eyes, recognition, respect, and the quiet certainty that he had been right. She was the bridge he had been searching for. The following week unfolded under a Seattle sky that seemed to hover permanently between rain and sunlight, as if the city itself wasn't sure what ending it wanted for the story that was quietly forming within its glass towers and misty harbors. Claire Whitford woke before dawn each day, nerves buzzing with anticipation. The private tea meeting with Margaret Harrington set for Friday morning felt like a silent verdict waiting in the wings. She rehearsed every possible scenario in her mind, pressing her palms against her thighs to steady the flutter in her chest each time doubt crept in. But as the days passed, something else started taking root inside her confidence, fragile and luminous, like a match burning in darkness for the first time. On the morning of the meeting, the city's weak winter light filtered through shifting clouds, casting a watery brilliance across the grand Harrington flagship building in downtown Seattle. The structure, built in the 1950s, still bore its original Art Deco facade, an architectural whisper of the era, when craftsmanship was king. It stood tall in defiance against the city's modern steel and glass landscape, much like its owner, Margaret Harrington. Inside, the lobby resembled the entryway of a museum, polished marble floors, ironwork railings, and display cases filled with vintage aviation interiors, handcrafted seats, and intricate cabin light fixtures that had made the Harrington name famous. Claire stepped through the revolving doors, her breath catching in her throat. She wore a fitted navy dress beneath a simple gray coat, her chestnut hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She looked like someone who belonged here, even if her heart was still learning to believe it. Waiting near the reception desk was Wyatt Harrington. His tall frame leaned slightly against a glass display case, hands tucked awkwardly in his pockets. He offered her an earnest smile that brightened his hazel eyes. Wyatt had shaved, though a faint shadow remained on his jawline. His sandy blonde hair was as untamed as ever, refusing to obey the Jill that attempted to discipline it. "Morning," he said. "You ready?" "No," Claire admitted, honestly. "But I'm here." He laughed softly. "That's enough." Before they could say more, a familiar voice rang out. Wyatt stopped loitering like an anxious schoolboy. Margaret Harrington approached them, walking briskly despite her age. Her navy pencil skirt and cream blouse fit perfectly, her silver hair shining under the soft lobby lights. There was something regal in the way she held her chin, a woman who had weathered decades of storms without once lowering her crown. Yet her eyes, sharp as winter steel, softened ever so slightly when she regarded Claire. "Miss Whitford," she said, "come, let us talk." She led them upstairs to a private salon, small, intimate, lined with dark wood shelves and walls adorned with framed sketches, early blueprints, and photographs of aviation pioneers. A circular table stood at the center, set with a porcelain tea service painted with forget-me-nots. Seated inside already was Elise Marquette, Margaret's lifelong friend and informal advisor, a thin, elegant woman in her 70s with ivory white hair in a chignon and delicate wireframe glasses. Her almond-shaped eyes held a softness tinged with quiet wisdom. Elise had been Margaret's confidant since their youth, and her presence brought a certain gentleness into the room that Margaret herself often refused to show. Elise smiled warmly. "Please sit, my dear. We've been waiting to meet you properly." Claire took her seat, palms resting lightly on her lap. Tea was poured. Steam drifted upward like whispers. Margaret lifted her cup, but her gaze never left Claire's face. "Before we speak of business," she said, "I want to understand you, not your resume, if you have one, nor your intentions, which may or may not be influenced by Mr. Calder." Her lips twitched minutely. "I want to know who you are." Claire swallowed. She had expected numbers, strategy, objections. She hadn't expected this. "I'm no one special," she began. Wyatt frowned slightly, but Margaret simply arched a stern eyebrow. "Nonsense. Only people who are special begin sentences like that. Try again." Claire took a slow breath. "I was studying linguistics, French and socio-cultural communication. I wanted to build bridges between people who misunderstood each other. But life happened. I went home. I started serving coffee instead of analyzing language." She shrugged softly. "I guess I thought the part of me that cared about cultural connection had died." "But it hadn't," Elise said gently. "It was waiting." Margaret nodded, eyes thoughtful. "And you," she murmured, "understood something in that meeting last week that no one else did. You saw Eleanor's blueprint for what it was." Claire glanced toward a framed piece hanging behind Margaret's chair, a sketch of the first cabin layout, delicate lines that conveyed both precision and emotion. Your mother was designing more than an interior. She was designing a legacy. At that, Margaret's breath hitched, not visibly, but enough for Claire to notice the faint tremble in her fingers. "Let me be plain, Miss Whitford," the old woman said. "I love my company. It is my life's work. But it is also dying. Slow enough for pride to ignore, but fast enough for fear to keep me awake at night. Wyatt wants to save it, but youth is careless." "You—" She paused, studying Claire, as though trying to see the exact moment her soul had formed. "You remind me of Eleanor." She listened. She understood the lines between the words. A knock sounded soft, hesitant. The door opened, revealing Victor Hale Harrington's operations manager, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with sandy hair pulled neatly back and sharp blue eyes behind rectangular glasses. His face carried the sternness of someone who had spent 2 decades managing logistics with military discipline. His posture was stiff hands clasped behind his back. "Apologies for interrupting," he said. "Mr. Calder has arrived." Margaret nodded. "Send him in." Evan entered with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his life navigating storms, both personal and corporate. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his steel blue eyes steady. For a split second, he looked at Claire, not long, not intensely, just enough to anchor her. "Madame Harrington," he said respectfully. Margaret gestured for him to sit. "Let us finish what we began." And so they spoke not of numbers, not of mergers, not of expansion. They spoke of legacy, of narratives, of preserving the soul of a craft in a world changing too quickly. Evan listened more than he talked. Claire translated emotion when words faltered. Elise offered historical anecdotes. Wyatt counterbalanced tradition with cautious innovation. At the end of the 2-hour meeting, Margaret exhaled slowly. "Very well," she said. "We will sign." Wyatt nearly collapsed in relief. Evan's shoulders loosened. Elise smiled. Margaret turned to Claire. "But only if she said, pointing her delicate finger toward Claire, is part of the integration team." Evan nodded without hesitation. "Of course." 3 days later, the papers were signed. The deal was done. That evening, in a quiet private lounge atop Calder Aeronautics headquarters, Evan asked to speak with Claire alone. The sky outside was streaked with purple clouds, the city glowing gold beneath the descending dusk. "You changed everything," he told her, standing with his hands in his pockets, gaze focused on the skyline. "My team couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. But you did." Claire shook her head. "I just listened." That, Evan said softly, is the rarest skill of all. He turned to face her fully. "I want to offer you a permanent position," he said. Director of Cross-Cultural Strategy. Full salary housing stipend, full education support if you choose to complete your degree. Claire's heart thudded. It was more than she'd ever dreamed, but something inside her, something new, strong awakened by the last 2 weeks, rose to the surface. "Thank you," she said, voice steady, "but I don't want a gift." Evan blinked. "A gift, I want responsibility," she said. "Let me lead the Harrington integration. Give me a team. Give me goals. If I meet them, I want a small equity stake. I'll pay for my own degree." For a moment, silence hung suspended. Then Evan smiled, truly. Smiled something warm and bright, breaking through his usually reserved exterior. "You want to build something," he said quietly. "I do." He extended his hand. "Then build it with me." She shook his hand, feeling a spark travel up her arm. For the first time in years, Claire felt entirely radiantly herself. She was no longer a forgotten waitress. She was a woman writing her future across the sky. At the end of Claire's journey, one truth rises above everything else. Sometimes the smallest moment, a single word spoken in kindness, can open a door that only God Himself could have prepared. In a world where we often feel unseen or unheard, grace has a way of finding us in the most unexpected places. A forgotten talent, a buried dream, a quiet act of compassion. These are the seeds God uses to create miracles. Claire thought her life was ordinary, invisible even. But God has a way of reminding us that nothing placed in our hearts is accidental. No gift goes unnoticed. No kindness is wasted. Sometimes He sends the right people at the right time to pull us back into the light. Maybe your breakthrough is waiting just one act of courage ahead. Maybe your miracle is already on its way. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and tell us what part spoke to you. And if you believe that God can open doors, no one else can close, comment Amen to stand in faith with us. Do not forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of grace and second chances. May God bless you and keep you always. Amen.